Welcome to Truth Be Told. We're excited to be here again for another episode, and today we've got a few questions that we're talking about. And where do we begin when we're new to the Bible, we've never read it before, or we've read parts of it, but we really don't know where to go for certain things, just kind of an overview of different sections because they all have different parts.
Yeah. So if we're thinking, let's give a breakdown. The Bible, there's 39 Old Testament books.
Yep.
And 27 New Testament books. And we would say Older Testament, and I'll break that down, Older Testament or Newer Testament rather than Old Testament, because often when we think Older Testament,
it's old.
That's like an old car, right?
Right.
And an old car versus a new car is passé, and which isn't true. And so, first of all, let's give an overview. Some people will look at it and say, okay, there's so much in the Older Testament that I don't understand. Mm-hmm. And even in the New, there's some difficult stuff. Peter says about Paul that Paul wrote some things that were hard to be understood. Mm-hmm. So here's a brief summary. It says the Old Testament is a New Testament concealed. Right. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. Right. And you've got all of these writers that write over a long period of time, and some would say, well, they can contradict one another. No, once you start to know the Scriptures, you see how that they blend together. They work,
weave together. Yeah.
Actually, yeah, and dovetail there, Max.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And Max, if I were just opening up the Bible for the first time, where would I start?
Well, I would say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because, well, I've been told that too. But at the same time, reading it and doing that and then starting there, some people will read it once and then it's like, okay, now where? Well, I just tell them, go back to the beginning of Matthew again, honestly, but read those four because it is the account of Jesus' life.
Okay.
And that gives us an example of who we're supposed to be and who we're supposed to follow, what this life is about. And anyway, I really didn't growing up even, so until I read it over and over, I don't know how many times, and read it, listened to it. I still feel like I don't know it, but...
Well, you'll feel like that the rest of your life because the more you know of the Word of God, the deeper and the deeper it gets, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a verse in Psalm that says, deep calls unto deep at the noise of your water spouts. And so the deeper you go, and then the Spirit of God takes us deeper into that. And so if you're to pick up the Bible, and you would normally assume that it gets like any other book, you start in, the first chapter, the first verse, And so the book of Genesis is the book of beginnings. Mm-hmm. And so you pick that up and you begin to read, and it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so you would begin to read that, and pretty soon you go Genesis, and then you come to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. And that's the first five. That's called the Torah. The first five books are called the Torah, the books of the law. Yeah. And in those first five books, you've got creation, and you've got sin, and you've got the downfall, but then you start getting into Exodus. Exodus is the exodus of the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Yeah. And then you get Leviticus, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and in those ones you're starting to get to the law, and you're getting the sacrifice, and you go, what is that, right?
It's a tough slog.
It's a really tough spot because a lot of people will go that and the book of Numbers, why is that in there? And so I'll come back to that in a minute. So if you're just picking up the Bible for the first time, I would recommend reading the Gospels, which the Gospel simply means good news. Yeah. It's the good news of Jesus. Yeah. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's a story of Jesus. And from four different authors' point of view, you've got Matthew, who had been a tax collector. He writes, and he presents Jesus as king. Yeah. So he begins with that. The genealogy of Jesus as king is in there, and Matthew chapter 1 is the genealogy. Matthew chapter 2 is the wise men come to find where is he that is born king of the Jews. And so as you go through, you get to chapter number 5. and we'll skip a little bit there. 5, 6, and 7 is Sermon on the Mount, but it's really Jesus explaining what kingdom living is here and now.
Here and now. I was going to say here and now because the kingdom is now.
The kingdom
It is now forward, then forward, I should say. Now, one question to that is, because it's 4 different perspectives, 4 different people, does that validate or invalidate that?
Yeah, absolutely, Max. So if you and I and Kelsey were outside and we're looking down 100 here, and there's an accident that happens, and so the police officer comes over to us, and he starts to take notes. If we all write something different, does that invalidate that we witnessed the accident?
Definitely not.
Why not?
Because I saw it from my perspective, he saw it from his, and you saw it from yours.
Yeah.
And we're going to see, one thought is, okay, I drive a Chevy. Generally speaking, I see Chevys a whole lot more than I see any other truck. Not out of preference or anything, but because I drive one. You driving a, I don't know, semi-truck from back in the day, whatever it was, you probably would have, I don't know. I'm just looking at examples. We pick out details that we see, and we see what we want to see sometimes, but we don't necessarily pick up everything.
So Matthew, he was a tax collector for the Romans, and
Right.
And once he sees Jesus, starts following him, he goes, "This is the King," and so he writes from that perspective. And you're going through all of that. He really presents Jesus as King. This is the King of the Jews, and so he writes from that perspective. And Mark, who is John Mark, and he goes and he collects the information, and he's the shortest book, 16 chapters, and in it, Mark, when he's writing, the first of it, he goes, and immediately you can almost see him just bang, bang, and so Luke is a doctor, and
Luke, sorry, just one, because was he a disciple at the time, during that period of time? This is the question.
So he's not one of the inner core disciples.
Okay.
And so he writes about it that he's gone and he's examined this, and he puts all of the evidence together. He's doing it as a doctor would.
Yeah.
And he writes things. When you see when somebody is injured or when a death happens, he puts little bites in there that come from a doctor's perspective.
And those aren't in a lot of the other.
Absolutely. And he also writes the book of Acts. And and so from that, and so when we look at these perspectives, so John, John's is that disciple, and what perspective does John write from?
Well, he was the one that Jesus loved.
And so what do you think that the one that says, I'm the one that Jesus loved, and I'm sure that created a little bit of animosity with the other disciples, but what do you see as you're looking through that really stands out to you?
That's a common theme through the whole book. How to love one another, what that looks like, being one with Christ, which, that inner depth of knowing somebody.
So so he writes, first thing he says, "For God so loved the world," right?
Yeah.
And so he gives us what that love looks like. For God so loved the world, John 3:16, and then we get to chapter 13. He says, "As I've loved you, love one another." And so he's giving that perspective. So each of those, and I tell people, when you're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, forget about what your neighbor has said about Jesus, or what you've heard about Jesus, or what you've said about Jesus. Just keep watching him. See how he talks to people. See how he treats people. See how he touches people, and people that nobody else would touch.
Yeah.
And some of us often feel like that in our lives. Nobody really wants to touch me or be near me or whatever. And
I think it's important. This is part of the reason, probably growing up and then becoming an adult and doing that, reading it for myself. And but I think it's important for us to take ourselves and set ourselves in the scene, so we can kind of read between the lines, but experience that. Because some of the things that he says and does, we think, okay, we read it and it's like, yeah, that's great. But then we think, if we were to do that to one another, it's like, that's weird, or it's a countercult. Like it just doesn't make sense to our.
Yeah, well, almost
brain.
everything that Jesus says and does is countercultural.
Yeah.
Whether it's a Roman culture, whether it's a religious culture of his day, and he touches the Pharisees or he touches the lepers. Nobody wanted to touch them or wanted for anybody to touch them, and so and you see. It's countercultural what he's saying, and so you just watch Jesus and see who Jesus really is, rather than who you thought Jesus was.
Right.
And he talks about when he came. He said, "I came to seek and to save that which was lost." And so you see him looking for those that are lost, those that are hurting, those that are broken. And it was said that he was a friend of sinners.
Mm-hmm.
What's significant about that, Max? When Jesus declares that, who's around him at that time?
Well, sinners.
What kind of sinners?
All kinds, and that goes from the pretty much all of them.
Well, you
But
think
like
about,
if you're a friend of if you're self-righteous and you're like, wow, I'm good, and then you look down at your friend over here that's like, oh, he needs Jesus. Well, it's like, well, Jesus is a friend to him, but it's not making one person better than the other. It's I can't deal with that myself. But he's a friend of, so he would be a friend of mine because, well, I'm a sinner.
yeah,
So,
I think about that when he said that he's a friend of sinners, right?
Yeah.
What they thought was the deepest of insults was the highest of compliments.
100%. Yeah, and that goes for all of us.
And you think about those that are gathered around him and that he seeks out. It's called, the prostitutes. Those that are that are the harlots, and he's sitting with them, right?
Yeah.
And he's having this conversation, and he meets them where they are.
Yeah.
He meets them in the middle of their messes, and that's one of the things that I love about Jesus is as you're reading through, he's not waiting till people clean themselves up until he meets them where he meets us in the middle of our mess. Yeah. And so you've got Matthew through there, and you begin to read in that. And so give you just a little bit more of an overview. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The book of Acts is now Jesus has been crucified, resurrected, ascended into heaven, and he gives them the great command or the great commission, go ye into all the world. And so now that's the beginning of what we would call the church. And they're going out, and he tells them to go into all the world and begin where they are and continue to expand that out. And then, so you see the church beginning, the body of Jesus beginning. Yeah. And some people say, well, we need to go back to the church because that's kind of the perfect place. No. So then you come to the epistles.
Yeah, I was going to say that's essentially what the whole next section is about the churches and the letters to the churches and the
why does he write the letters to churches, Max?
Well, they've got challenges, conflicts. There's good things, but there's also all the other things, and it's just pointing those out in different letters from. Absolutely.
So then on through from Romans on through, you've got this. He writes to them. They've got problems. He's telling, God is revealing to them how. And then you come to the book of Revelation, which we're at all the nations now.
Yep.
What's that about?
The revelation of Jesus Christ. Revelation.
Yes.
Not
plural.
Not plural. So it's one and.
Yeah. And in that, it's a revelation of Jesus Christ in all of his glory, all of his wonder. And this is John seeing him. Remember, he's the one that Jesus loved, and he saw Jesus in all of his humanity, and now he's seeing him in all of his deity and his wonder and his power and his glory. And he's seeing him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Yeah. And so he begins to reveal that.
And I want to not bring it back, but is it Peter that says, so this is kind of coming back to the Old Testament. We've kind of overviewed the New.
Yeah, and we'll get that in the next session.
Yeah, so I'm just going to end on that note. These things were written for our example. Yeah, so I think what we could do is, we'll speak to that in the next episode. So I just want to say thank you for joining us here at Truth Be Told. That's part one of a kind of a Bible overview. And I know it's helped me. I mean, this explanation... growing up, even in the church, I had I didn't really understand what section was what. So I think we hope that it provides some value for you to understand. And just thanks for joining us again. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.